Hear these words from the Hebrew Scriptures. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water."
I asked my wife Casey what she wanted for Mother's Day. She said a short sermon. How will I do that, I asked. He said, write a good opening and a good closing and then put them as close together as possible. So before I give Casey her Mother's Day present, pray with me. Startle us, O God, with your Spirit this day. Allow the words that are shared from these ancient scriptures to become as fresh as the new morning dew. Amen. Here's the question. What if I were to tell you that what you choose to do this week could change the world? Would you believe me? Imagine it so. Or would you smile politely but secretly scoff? What you do this week can change the world. Do you believe that? Well, this morning I'd like to introduce you to 5 women who did just that. They made a decision, they took a chance, they made a choice, and their actions changed the world. The story goes like this. It's around 1142 BC, and a new Pharaoh has assumed power in Egypt, and this ruler, wishing to solidify his political base and to shore up solidarity among his people, identifies a cultural scapegoat group, the Hebrews. Sound familiar? He does this because Pharaoh was a shrewd politician, and he knew that the Egyptians could all feel a little more united if they could just join together in hating the same enemy. So Pharaoh's first move is to enslave the Hebrew people who'd been living among them in peace and harmony for over 100 years. But then Pharaoh turns to even darker means by telling 2 Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah that they are to kill all the Hebrew babies that are delivered among the Hebrew clan. But Shiphrah and Puah refuse, choosing not to kill the baby boys at birth. And when called before Pharaoh, they tell a lie. They tell him that the Hebrew women give birth too quickly, thus delivering the babies before the midwives even arrive on the scene. It's a courageous act, really, lying to a Pharaoh. It's a dangerous act, really. It's one that could be punishable by death. But Shiphrah and Puah take the risk nonetheless. Now you may be wondering, so how does their refusal to kill the newly born Hebrew babies change the world? Because one of the Hebrew baby boys that was spared by Shiphrah and Puah's defiance of Pharaoh will one day lead the Hebrews out of Egyptian captivity, bringing them to the promised land. There they will form a nation which will bring forth a Messiah that we know is Jesus our Christ, who is the most influential person the world has ever seen. And it all starts here. It starts here with these two women, Shiphrah and Puah, two women who are willing to stand up to an injustice that they're witnessing in their midst, two women who I doubt very much thought that their actions would affect anything but their own conscience and maybe a few Hebrew families. Yet here they are, two women, by being faithful, by following the dictates of their hearts and heeding the call of conscience, unknowingly helped in changing the world forever. Let me ask you again, do you think what you do could change the world? Have any of you ever read the book, The Butterfly Effect by Andy Andrews? Anybody read the book? In this book, as Artie Mixner knows, Andrews catalogs the extraordinary impact of simple and courageous decisions and efforts that have changed our world. But fascinatingly, when you go back and you look more deeply into them, you can never really tell which efforts in a chain of events actually made the biggest difference. Take this one, for example. Over the last 40 years, 2 billion lives have been saved worldwide by the development of a high-yield, disease-resistant corn which can be grown in arid climates. Now, this hybrid corn was developed by a man named Norman Borlaug, a professor at the University of Minnesota, from which our daughter graduates in a few weeks. Go Gophers! I just had to add that because my daughter's watching by internet. Anyway, Borlaug won a Nobel Prize for this brilliant, significant advance, and he's now been given the title of the man who saved 2 billion lives. But should Norman Borlaug really be credited with this title? Or should the title of the man who saved 2 billion lives instead go to Henry Wallace? For after all, the former vice president under Roosevelt, while he was Secretary of Agriculture, was Henry Wallace. And it was Wallace who envisioned and created a research facility in New Mexico to develop this hybrid seed for arid climates. And it was Wallace who actually hired Norman Borlaug to run it and do the work. So maybe, yes, Henry Wallace should be given this title. It was his vision. Or should the title of the man who saved 2 billion lives be given to Henry Wallace's mentor, George Washington Carver, who, while a student at Iowa State University, was not allowed as an African American to live in the dorms. So he was taken in by a very kind family, the Wallace family. And it was while living there that a college-age Carver would take young 8-year-old Henry Wallace, soon to be Vice President and Secretary of Agriculture, taking Henry Wallace on weekly nature walks in the woods, instilling in Wallace his love of plants, and inspiring Wallace to become an agronomist in the first place. So you see it, maybe George Washington Carver should be given this title, the man who saved 2 billion lives. Or should the title go to Moses and Sarah Carver? For after all, when young George's parents were killed, it was the Carver family who adopted young George, instilling within him a love for learning and saving enough money to send him off to school. Is it Moses and Sarah Carver who adopted George Washington Carver, enabling him his education at Iowa State University, which led to Carver mentoring young Henry Wallace and inspired him to become an agronomist, and in time appointed Norman Borlaug to research hybrid-resistant corn? Shouldn't Moses and Sarah Carver be given the title of the ones who saved 2 billion lives? What do you think? You see my point, of course. Whether we know it or not, all are interconnected. The things we do, our decisions, our choices, our passions do in fact ripple out with consequences for good or for ill, for the health or damage of the world. And the question isn't whether, but what. What will we do this week to make a difference in the world? Some of these actions may be big, they may be bold, they may be courageous, others may be small and hardly noticeable. And yet, they all have the potential to ripple out to affect countless lives, something we see in these first two women, Shiphrah and Puah, who stood quietly up to a bully and a tyrant in an action that changed the world. And as we read on, we see they're not alone in their courage. For the story continues with three more. The first one's name is Jochebed. Jochebed, we're told, gives birth to a baby which will change the world. One of the male babies that Shiphrah and Puah refused to kill. And desperate to find some way to preserve his life because of Pharaoh's decree, she makes a basket, seals it with pitch so it will not sink, and sets her child afloat on the edge of the Nile, knowing that it was the custom of Pharaoh's daughter to bathe near that spot on the Nile each and every day. Now, I once heard it said that when you're a mother, you're never really alone in your thoughts. For a mother always has to think twice, once for herself and once for her child. And we can see this assertion at play in Jochebed's story. Because if Jochebed was to think only of herself, she never would have risked hiding her child. But Jochebed was willing to give her son up, breaking her own heart in order to preserve his life, a choice which changed the world. And it's here that a fourth woman enters the narrative, whose name is Miriam. Miriam is the sister of the little baby who's been set forth in the basket, and Miriam stands by the Nile to see what will happen when the little basket is spotted by Pharaoh's daughter. And then, mindless of the possible danger, when Pharaoh's daughter has the baby pulled from the water, Miriam rushes to the daughter, offering to find a nurse for the baby, knowing, of course, who that nurse will be. Jochebed, the baby's mother. Clever girl, brave girl, courageous girl, wouldn't you say? Young Miriam stood up to power and received that which she sought, a choice which helped change the world. And then, of course, the fifth and final woman of note in our story of five women who changed the world is, well, the Pharaoh's daughter. Midrash has given her the name of Bithiah. You want to use that for your next child? I didn't think so. But what an interesting character this Bithiah is. Pulling the baby from his little basket in the water, we're told she knows instantly he's a Hebrew child who's been condemned to death by her father. But for some reason, she chooses to defy the decree of her father. Now, why do you suppose Bithiah made the choice to do so? Is this an adolescent rebellion? Is it some kind of daughterly defiance? Or is it more than that? You know what I like to think? I like to think that maybe Bithiah made this choice in part because she was so very different from her father, choosing not to adopt his cruelty, not to adopt his intolerance, his manipulating presence, and his violent nature. Because perhaps, like this little baby in the basket, Bithiah had a mother too, who had a great effect upon her. A mother who showed her compassion, self-sacrifice, courage, resourcefulness, and even a willingness to love and care for others different than her. Because that is what Pharaoh's daughter did here, didn't she? Yes, I like to think she learned something from her mother, something that made her the woman that she had become. Now, you might have heard the words of Dorothy Law Nolte from her work, Children Love What They Learn. It goes like this. If a child lives with criticism, he learns to condemn. If a child lives with hostility, she learns to fight. If a child lives with ridicule, he learns to be shy. If a child lives with shame, she learns to feel guilty. If a child lives with tolerance, he learns to be patient. If a child lives with encouragement, she learns confidence. If a child lives with praise, he learns appreciation. If a child lives with fairness, she learns justice. Yes, Pharaoh's daughter, Bithiah, was entitled to hate this baby, even kill it, but she didn't. In fact, she gave him his name. She gave him his name, Moses, which means to draw out, which is what Moses will end up doing when he leads the Hebrew people out of Egypt in the years to come. And I like to think the reason she accepted this baby as her own is that she had adopted the expansive love that her mother taught her in the first place. A love that was bigger than me, bigger than my home, bigger than my tribe. A love that reaches everywhere. 5 women who followed their hearts. 5 women who acted on what they knew to be right. 5 women who followed their conscience, made a decision, and in so doing, through the then baby Moses, these 5 women changed the world. You see, folks, let me let you in on a little secret. The biggest history makers may not always be the generals or the presidents or the Hollywood rich and famous. For more often than not, in God's world, the real history makers in this world are those who sit quietly by, choosing to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, following their hearts, following their conscience, following what they have been taught by others, because that's all God needs to send a shot of Christ's Spirit to do God's good work in this world. All God needs is a willing heart, a loving spirit, and a courageous soul. That is it. So let me ask you again. Do you think you can change the world? Can I go a few more minutes? Mamie Till Mosley never certainly thought that her one lone voice could. I've told you her story before. Mamie lived in Chicago. And in 1941, Mamie birthed a son, and she named him Emmett. In the summer of 1955, Emmett decided he wanted to go spend some time in Mississippi. Mississippi. I learned that in the 3rd grade. Well, tragically, while in Mississippi, Emmett was killed at the hands of some alcohol-infused racists. Well, when young Emmett's brutalized body was returned to Chicago, Mamie Mobley decided, against all advice, to have an open casket for her family and friends so they could see what racial hatred had done to her son. Well, on the day of the showing, not just a few of her friends and family came, but thousands of others came as well, filing past Emmett's open casket in this South Side Chicago church. And soon, millions, through newspaper and television coverage, were suddenly able to see what the ugliness of racism looked like in the open casket of Emmett Mobley. Well, months later, 2 men who murdered Emmett were tried in a segregated court, and they were acquitted despite all the evidence pointing towards their guilt. And it might seem that the story ends there, right there, with Mamie Mobley's little act of exposing the brutal outcome of injustice quietly now tucked away. It's over with, and it is done. But there's yet another woman to consider, who at first does not appear to be part of this story, and yet she's deeply connected. For this other woman had been following this story of Emmett Mobley in her own hometown newspaper, the Montgomery Advertiser. And so furious was this woman at the miscarriage of justice for this poor young man and his grieving mother, that 2 days later, this woman named Rosa Parks refused to get up out of her seat and go to the back of the bus in Montgomery. And the rest is history, is it not? You see it, don't you? Like Shiphrah and Puah, Jochebed, Miriam and Bithia. Maybe Mobley's actions may have seemed to be just one small brick in the building of God's kingdom, a brick, a choice that was suddenly hidden seemingly in the dark. But in time, Mamie's decision that she made with courage and conviction played its part inspiring Rosa Parks, who in turn led a young local Montgomery minister named Martin Luther King Jr. to become involved, which led to a much-needed, long-awaited step towards greater justice in our country. Wow, what a story. Little, voiceless Mamie Tilley from Chicago. You know, one could say Mamie Tilley should be given the title of the mother of the civil rights movement. A woman who changed the world. Do you believe that? Do you believe you can change the world? I hope you do. Because as Margaret Mead has said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. In the name of God the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.